Good evening, everybody. I am so grateful to have you all with us this evening to explore a little bit of Jewish sources as it relates to some of the very challenging questions surrounding a woman's right to choose that have come to the forefront of our conscience, certainly since the leak of the draft version of Justice Alito's opinion emerged a few months ago. And then, of course, on Friday, as the opinion itself, which did not deviate in any real meaningful way from that original draft, was issued by the Supreme Court. There have been just an incredible range of emotions that so many people have experienced and have shared about this ruling and about its impact on America, on women, on mothers today and mothers to be. And I want to just name a few things as we begin tonight. So the first is that I am not a mother. I've been blessed to be a partner with Amy, the mother of our three children, through each of her pregnancies, which were challenging and difficult physically and emotionally. And I recognize that there is some measure of irony about your male rabbi leading this discussion. And we had hoped that we would be able to have some of the women who are part of our clergy team participate in future events. I'm confident that we will. It just happened because we planned this event so quickly following the decision on Friday that because of schedules and some personal commitments, the other members of our clergy team weren't able to be here. And I also want to name the fact that in our congregation, there are different ways in which people are reacting to this ruling. There are some who have reached out to me who are in deep grief and heartsick and anguished because of the ramifications of this ruling. And there are also within our congregation those who are quietly and sometimes not quietly rejoicing at this ruling because of the way in which they and their own moral judgments think about the status of a fetus and what abortion means. And so I want to acknowledge just from the very beginning that the questions that we are considering are really complicated and are painful. And the change in American law is, I think, also very challenging and for many, many, many people, frightening. And I want to spend some time today looking at what our tradition teaches about this, because not only do I think hopefully it will influence and help us understand what is important in Jewish wisdom that we can glean as we think about our own formation of our moral choosing and our belief system. But also, I think knowing what our tradition teaches will hopefully galvanize us as a community in thinking about how we want to respond to the changes that are coming so quickly in so many places in our country as a result of this ruling that was handed down on Friday. So I just want to thank all of you, especially our communications team, Kira and Susan, for helping to organize this so quickly. And this will not be the only thing that we do at Temple Bethel in response to this, but I wanted to have the opportunity to at least begin the conversation today so that we can educate ourselves. Part of what we do as Reformed Jews is we look to what our tradition has taught over the centuries to help us in our autonomous way to figure out how we want to respond to the questions, the moral questions of our day. And so because we are not an overwhelmingly large group, there will be opportunities for you to engage in dialogue tonight and for questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to please put that question in the chat. And our fabulous producer, Kira, is going to consolidate those questions so that we can answer them as part of our discussion. And we may have the opportunity for some dialogue as well as part of our evening this evening, when you'll be invited to unmute a little bit later in the program after we've had a chance to explore these different sources, so that we'll have an opportunity to dialogue a little bit. And so I'm going to invite you, please, to join me in a moment of prayer, that we can think about the study of Torah, and just hope that we recognize how fortunate we are that we are blessed as Jews with this remarkable storehouse of wisdom and tradition to guide us when we have to face these very complicated moral questions. So please say with me, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. So to begin, I'm going to ask us just to think a little bit about what it is that makes this question so difficult. And the reason I think about this is because we terminate the life of different living creatures all the time. How many of you have ever realized that in your home, perhaps in your bathroom, there was a palmetto bug or a cockroach? Anybody ever have one of those things? And if you had one of them, how many of you grabbed a sneaker or asked someone in your house to grab a sneaker and you dispatched that palmetto bug on its palmetto way? Well, sure. I'm getting some thumbs up from people. I have been enlisted by my family to do that on innumerable occasions. When you squashed that palmetto bug, how many of you felt a sense of a violation of a moral good? That you had done a sinful act by destroying that palmetto bug? Was there anybody who felt like you had done a bad thing by destroying that palmetto bug? No, right? And even because we think of those things as not quite the same as other life. Has anyone ever had the experience where you're driving and a squirrel dashes in front of your car, and even though you try to swerve and get out of the way, you can't do anything about it, and your squirrely friend meets their end under your tire? It's heartbreaking, right? It's terrible. Is there anybody that thinks that should be a crime? No, right? It's unfortunate and it's sad if we kill a squirrel, but there is some sense that, like, a roach or a squirrel is not the same as a human being. And it's because we think of a human being as being of a different order of value than we have for other life that this question is complicated. Because for those of us who are meat eaters, right, we consume living creatures. For those who fish or hunt, you kill living creatures for food or even for sport. And we can talk about the moral valence of those decisions, but it's different than a human being. And if you look at the source that we have here, the very first source that I'd like to share with you, this is what it says at the beginning of Genesis 5:1. It says, "This is the record of the generations of humanity. When God created humankind, it was made in the likeness of God. Male and female were they created, and when they were created, God blessed them and called them humankind." So what makes a human being different from any other creature? It's this idea that we are created in the image of God, that there is some element to what it means to be a human being that is divine, that we possess a holy essence to our being called a soul, and that there is a kernel of holiness, a kernel of godliness that is within a human being that makes a human life of ultimate and infinite value, perhaps different than that of other creatures. But then we have to ask ourselves, when it says in the Torah that our lives are created in God's image, well, what does that really mean? What makes a human being different from any other creature? And what makes a human being different is something that human beings do that no other creature does, which is included in what we have all gathered to do here tonight, which is what Saforno, the Spanish commentator on the Torah, said in the Middle Ages. And he said that when you think about what it means to be created in God's image, what it means is that you have free will. It is in this respect that humanity is like God. And this is why when different generations of humanity angered God, they were punished. Why is it that we have this difference, that we are somehow separate? Is because we can make moral choice, that we can have and exercise free will. How many of you have a dog? Anybody have a dog? Anybody have a dog who is joining them in the program tonight? Right? If you have your dog, you're welcome to bring them to join us. Okay. I have a dog. I used to make fun of dog people. I am now one of those people that I used to make fun of. There's a few dogs. Thank you for bringing them around. I'm grateful that they are here. Dogs are fabulous, but dogs do not do something that we do, which is they do not sit around and talk about the meaning of their own existence. So does your dog sort of say, it's summertime in Florida and it's hot and those UPS trucks don't have any air conditioning, and I'm just not going to bark at the UPS driver today because after all, they're delivering a package to my house and they're working hard. It's just not a nice thing to do. No, right? Dog sees UPS driver and barks because they do what dogs do. They don't think about whether it's right or wrong. They're not going to get any better at being a dog or any worse at being a dog. They're dogs, right? And the same could be said for just about every other creature. However, a human being is different. A human being is given the capacity to learn and to grow and to have deliberate consideration about what they do. And then, of course, to have to bear the consequences, the moral consequences of when they do something that tradition teaches is right or tradition teaches is wrong. So if someone is denied the ability to make a moral choice, in some measure, it is because they were robbed of that choice that they are actually robbed of some measure of their humanity. When we think about what our tradition, the core narrative of our tradition is one about liberation from slavery to freedom. And it isn't freedom for freedom's sake to do whatever we want. It's freedom so that we can live in covenantal partnership with the creator of the universe, the source of all good. And so God gave us a tremendous gift. And that gift is the gift of Torah, an instruction manual that guides us to know how to use the free will we've been given to make moral choices for the good. That's really what it means to be a human being, to have agency, to have freedom to make moral choices for what we want. There is a Torah out there that tells us what we should do and what we shouldn't do in various different circumstances. But the difference is that we as human beings are not just given the Torah and made to follow it. We are given a Torah and given free will to choose to follow it. And so when people are denied that access to their moral agency, they lose a piece of their humanity. And I think that part of what has made this decision so incredibly painful and difficult for us as Jews is that when the state comes in and says, no, you don't have a choice anymore, there is a sense that we have been a bit dehumanized. And that can be in a whole variety of different ways, but certainly it applies, I think, in some measure to the freedoms that are no longer available to many women in many different states. And so what I want to do in addition to that is also take a look at sort of what does Torah teach about human life and the growth of human life in the context of its development from fetus to humanity. And as I shared in my Shabbat message, there is a wonderful scholar of this subject at the University of Oxford, Professor Kate Greasley, and she says, I want you to imagine, she says, the paradox of a heap. Let's say I have a big bag of rice, and I start removing that rice one grain by one grain and put a pile in front of me. At some point, I can be said to have a heap of rice in front of me. Now, do I have a heap of rice with 1 grain, 2 grains, 4 grains, 8 grains, 14,644 grains? The answer is we don't really know, right? It's not like if I have 14,640 grains, I don't have a heap. And if I add 1 more grain of rice, I have a heap. But there is at some point in evolution that allows us to say, I have a heap. And where that is not always easy to determine. And so if you take a look at the idea of a human being, right? A human being starts with 2 cells and over time develops into a fully formed, God-willing human being. Where along that continuum does that ball of cells become a human being with the same status as one of us, a living, breathing human being already in the world? And so the Torah kind of looks at this question in an interesting way. We could take a look at this passage also from Rabbi Steinsaltz, who also reflects on the freedom that we have to change and to grow that makes us divine. And so if you look at the book of Exodus, right, it says very clearly in chapter 21, the ultimate sin, he that fatally strikes a person shall be put to death. Now we have in our consciousness this idea of what we might call in ethics a hierarchy of sin. So if anybody has ever, when you were little or maybe not so little, gone into a convenience store and you stole a pack of gum. Some of us might admit to having tried that when we were little kids, just to see what would happen. So let's say you went into a convenience store, you stole a pack of gum. What should be the penalty for somebody who steals a pack of gum from a convenience store? Well, they pay a fine. They say they're sorry. They repay the store, whatever it might be, right? Should someone get the death penalty for stealing a pack of gum from a convenience store? No, because we recognize that there is a difference in terms of a trespass of stealing a pack of gum from a convenience store and killing somebody. So the way that we know that killing somebody is the worst sin you can commit, it's because we mete out the worst punishment that you could get, which would be in the Torah, the death penalty. There's a whole other conversation to have one day about when the death penalty was imposed and not, but it's not so much whether the death penalty is imposed, it's the way that we understand what murder is. Murder is worthy of the worst penalty you can impose. So now take a look at what it says in this passage. Also in the same chapter 21 in the book of Exodus. It says, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. So what are the rabbis, what is the Torah teaching? This is long before the rabbis. This is text that is more than 3,000 years old. What it's teaching is that the fetus is not the same as a human being. And if somebody were to fight and to have something happened in the course of their pregnancy that a miscarriage was caused, an abortion, right? Abortion means the termination of a pregnancy. There's spontaneous abortion, which we might call miscarriage. There is deliberate abortion, which is when you do an act that causes the end of a pregnancy. What does the guy do? He sues him, right? Hey, you caused my wife to miscarry. That was going to be my son. That was going to be my heir. He was going to help me pasture the flock or farm the crops or whatever. And you owe me X. And they go to court and they figure out the payment and they pay. And so if the Torah thought a fetus was the same as an extant human being, we would impose the other penalty, right? If we thought it was that, we would say death penalty. But that's not how they looked at a fetus. They saw the fetus as being a part of the mother, different from an extant individual human life. In fact, in the Talmud, they said that if a woman is pregnant up until the 40th day, and when they count days, they're talking from when the woman last immersed in the mikveh, which would have been the day that she would have had relations with her husband. As many of us know, when a woman has her period, she would go into a place apart from her husband, and then a week after the flow had concluded, she would then go to the mikveh and she would be permitted to her husband, and the expectation would be that they would have relations that evening. Interestingly, the tradition says it is the man's responsibility to satisfy the woman, not the other way around. And so they count from that day. If there's 40 days from that day and she's pregnant, they say it's as if it's just fluid. It means nothing. It has no status whatsoever. And so the rabbis believed that conception was not the time that something became a life, that something happened over that period of time that allowed it to become a life. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the author of the Mishnah, said that a fetus is considered as if it's its mother's thigh. In other words, a part of its body, a part of its mother's body. And it is as though the master transferred ownership of one of her limbs to her. So what is the fetus? The fetus is like a part of the mother's body and was seen to be like that, which is why in the book of Exodus, when it says if somebody pushes her and she gets injured, they reckon it to be a damage like a broken arm, right? If somebody breaks your arm, you sue them for the pain and the suffering and the lost time at work and whatever that broken arm meant, and the medical bills and what have you, and they write a check and they say, all right, we're good with each other. So is a fetus only that? And the answer is no, it's obviously more complicated than that. And so the rabbis tell a story of a Roman figure named Antoninus. So Antoninus has a conversation with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the author of the Mishnah, and he says, hey, when does the soul enter into a person? Is it from the moment of conception, or is it from the moment of the formation of the embryo 40 days later? And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said to him, it's that moment of formation. It's on the 41st day. It's after that. But Antoninus said to him, that can't be true. It's inconceivable. Is it possible that a piece of meat could stand for even 3 days without salt as a preservative and wouldn't rot? The embryo couldn't exist for 40 days without a soul. That's its life force. It has to have a soul or it couldn't ever be what it is. So he argues the soul is placed in a human being from the moment of conception. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says, there may be some truth to that. And the truth is that he says there's a verse in the book of Job that says, and your providence, it says, Pikud atecha, your pikud, right, has preserved my spirit. Your godliness has preserved. And he says, indicating that it's from the moment of conception, your pikidah, that the soul is preserved within a person. And so why do I bring this text? Is because the rabbis really did not have consensus on when a human being became a life. When did it have a soul? There were some that said it was at conception. There were others that said after 40 days. There were others that said at the moment of quickening, right? Quickening is when you can feel movement within the mother's womb. Or some said it was when the baby took its first breath, right? The Hebrew word for soul is neshama. The Hebrew word for breath is neshima. It's the same word. So there were some that said it really doesn't become a life until until that baby is emerged into the world and takes its first breath. And because they didn't have consensus on this, they didn't rule on it as being one or the other. They also took a look and they said, well, even if it is a life, the mother's life takes precedence over its life. And there is an example in the Mishnah of what you might call rabbinic hyperbole, where the rabbis deliberately use a very, very jarring graphic image to teach a klal, to teach a point. And the point that they want to make is the following. If a woman has more than the usual difficulty in childbirth, the embryo within her should be dismembered limb by limb because her life takes precedence over its life. Now, did ever there come a time when they went into a woman's womb and cut up a fetus and removed it limb by limb? No. They're deliberately being as gross as possible because they're trying to teach a lesson. And the lesson is that you go to every length necessary to preserve the life of the mother up until the moment of childbirth, the crowning. And they say, but once its head or its greater part has emerged, it may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another. And so there was a sense among the rabbis that up until the moment of childbirth, no matter what you thought the status of that fetus was, the mother's life takes precedence. And so why did they believe that? And they believed it because they said there is this idea of what one might call a rodef. So let's say someone is coming to you and they're about to attack you. If someone is coming and they're about to attack you, what are you allowed to do? Or what are you even obligated to do? You're obligated to defend yourself, to defend your own life. And even if that means killing the attacker, you're entitled to take the attacker's life and defend your own because they are what you call a rodef, a pursuer. If you are shopping for a new synagogue and you see a synagogue whose name is Rodef Shalom, join that synagogue. Rodef Shalom means a pursuer of peace. If, however, you see a synagogue where the name is Rodef Kesef, don't join that synagogue. Rodef Kesef, pursuers of money, which may be what some synagogues do, but that one is one that you don't want to join. So a rodef is someone that's a pursuer, and the law is very clear that if someone is coming at you as a pursuer, you're entitled to defend yourself. But then the rabbis ask a different question. They say, what if the pursuer is a minor who may not necessarily know what he or she's doing? They don't realize that they don't have full capacity to decide morally what they're doing because they're children, they're little, but there's still an inherent danger. So Rav Huna says, if a child was pursuing another person in order to kill him, the pursued party may be saved with the pursuer's life, meaning that you can even take the life of a child if it means to save your own life, as tragic and terrible as this is. So Rav Chisda raised an objection to Rav Huna from a baraita. A baraita is something that the rabbis said that didn't quite make it into the Mishnah, but it's still a piece of wisdom you have to consider from the rabbis. And so Rav Huna says if a woman was giving birth and her life was being endangered by the fetus, then you can sacrifice the life of the fetus to save the mother. But then they say, is that true? But once his head has emerged during the birthing process, he may not be harmed in order to save the mother because one life may not be pushed aside to save another life. In other words, there is a sense that you can't say, I am going to kill you because I feel like it, or I'm going to kill you because my life is worth more than yours. Because human life is of infinite value, human life is also of equal value. So you can't set aside the life of one person to save another person. You can, however, if they're threatening you. And so they say, well, if the fetus is like a pursuer, who is endangering his mother's life, you can terminate the fetus to save the mother's life. And indeed, you are supposed to. And indeed, it is in many ways your obligation to do so. So he asks, right, if one is permitted to save the pursuit by killing the minor who is pursuing him, why is this so? Because the fetus is like a pursuer who is endangering his mother's life. And so the Gemara answers, right, with regard to the woman giving birth, she is being pursued by heaven. Since the fetus is not acting of his own volition, he's just trying to get born and endangering his mother of his own will, his life may not be taken in order to save his mother. So up until that moment of birth, when the baby is its own individual self, then even if that means that you have to take the mother's life, you can't set aside the child's life for the mother. However, up until that moment, the rabbis say the mother's life takes precedence. And Maimonides, 1,000 years later, will reaffirm that. And interestingly, Maimonides himself was a physician. And he said, our sages ruled that when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with drugs. It's amazing the prescience that they had 1,000 years ago for what we live with in our world today. For the fetus is considered a rodef, a pursuer of its mother. If the head of the fetus emerges, it should not be touched because one life should not be sacrificed for another. Although the mother may die, this is the nature of the world. So again, that sense of wisdom was unchanged for 1,000 years after the rabbis declared it around 2,000 years ago. But then it gets a little more complicated because, as you say, right, we kind of recognize that in that same paradox of a heap, there is a time at some point in the development of a fetus when it becomes a human being. And so according to Jewish law, I can violate all of the laws about Shabbat in order to save a life. And so the question becomes, can I violate the Sabbath if a woman dies in childbirth on the Sabbath to save the baby? Because the baby's not a life, then I can't violate the Sabbath to save it. And so the rabbis say something interesting. So it says a woman who dies while sitting on the birthing stool on Shabbat, we bring a knife to tear open her abdomen and remove the fetus. The language is not glorious, but what they're talking about is a C-section, right? There, in cases of violating Shabbat to save someone, permission was given because the person in question had at least presumption of having been alive. But here, where the fetus, the embryo, did not have such original presumption, it was never alive before, one might say you can't desecrate the Sabbath to save it, and therefore the law comes to tell you that you can and that you should. So there is a stage at some point when that fetus becomes valuable as a human being, worthy of having its life saved, if the mother has died in childbirth, or even if the mother hasn't. There is a sense that it has its own value. When that is really hard to say. Now, why is this so challenging? It's challenging because we think about life as having this sacred value, and that life, that fetus, could grow to be something of infinite value. If you think about how much we value the members of our family, our loved ones, our children, a fetus has the potential to grow to become that which we treasure beyond anything. So the Mishnah has this very famous passage that teaches, therefore, Adam, the first human being, was created alone. So if you look at the book of Genesis, right, there are swarms of bears, bees, bugs, and birds that are created at the beginning, but just one human being. Why is that, they say? And that's a teacher that anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, then the verse ascribes to him that he destroyed an entire world. As Adam was one person from whom the population of an entire world came forth. But conversely, anyone who saves an entire soul, it's as if he sustained an entire world. And so when we think about that particular concept, the preciousness of human life, when one would terminate a pregnancy is an awesome decision to make. And there were differences in terms of when the rabbis thought it was okay. And some more modern commentators and scholars took a very restrictive view. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who is probably the decisor of Jewish law in the 20th century, who's probably considered the most authoritative from a deeply religious background, said the following. They were considering the case of what would happen if a mother determined that her fetus had Tay-Sachs disease. And would it be okay for the mother to terminate a fetus if it was determined that it had Tay-Sachs disease? And Rabbi Feinstein says it would be forbidden, even if it was to save someone's life. The exception would be to save the life of the mother during childbirth, and not for any other need of the mother, which would be forbidden. Even for children for whom the doctors predict a very short lifespan, such as those children who are born with Tay-Sachs, which though newly developed tests can be diagnosed prenatally, it would be forbidden since there is no danger to the mother and the infant is not a pursuer. The infant is not trying to harm her. It may be tragic, it may be terrible, it may be heart-wrenching, but no, he would say it's not permitted to terminate that pregnancy. And he says one cannot permit an abortion even though there is very great suffering involved. And it's incontrovertible and clear, as I have written, a straightforward halacha according to the words of our masters and the commentaries, that abortion would be forbidden as a bona fide murder for any fetus, legitimate or a mamzer, whatever the reason was. If it was normal or if it had Tay-Sachs disease, you cannot do that. The only time he would say that you can terminate a pregnancy is if it is endangering the physical life of the mother. However, there was another rabbi, also very authoritative, who interestingly was the rabbi, his name was Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg lived in Jerusalem, and his synagogue was literally right down the street from the largest hospital in Jerusalem, Shari Zedek Hospital. And so it happened that a lot of the doctors in that hospital would often go to that synagogue before work, after work, at lunchtime to daven mincha, and they got to be friendly with Rabbi Waldenberg. And occasionally they would say, hey, you know what? I've got an interesting case of what's going on in the hospital. I wonder what you think Jewish law would say about this case. And so Rabbi Waldenberg became one of the foremost, if not the foremost expert in Jewish bioethics of the 20th century. And he wrote something very different than Rabbi Feinberg. He said, if there is danger to the mother from continuing the pregnancy, one should permit abortion without hesitation. Also, if her health is poor, and to cure her or to relieve her from great pain, it is necessary to abort the fetus, even if she is not actually in danger, there is room to permit it based on the halachic authorities, the Jewish legal authorities' evaluation of the situation. In the case of a baby who will have Tay-Sachs, he says, one should permit abortion as soon as it becomes evident without doubt from the test that indeed such a baby shall be born. If indeed we may permit an abortion according to the halakha because of a great need, because of the suffering of the mother, and because of pain and suffering. And it seems that this is the classic case for such permission. And it is irrelevant in what way the pain and suffering is expressed, whether it is physical or psychological. Indeed, psychological suffering is in many ways much greater than the suffering of the flesh. And also there was a great scholar who eventually made his way in 1933 to Israel, Rabbi Moshe Mordechai, who said mental health risk has been definitely equated to physical health risk. This woman who is in danger of losing her mental health unless the pregnancy is interrupted, therefore would accordingly qualify. And so when we think about what Judaism says about a woman's right to choose, there are really two different facets that we can consider. One is that there are cases when it's not only permissible for a woman to terminate her pregnancy, it's actually, according to Jewish law, mandatory, because a mother is required to protect herself. And if carrying the fetus is going to be a physical danger to the mother, there is universal agreement in Jewish sources that you can terminate a pregnancy to save the mother's physical life. And there are many, many sources that say, even if we're not talking about a physical endangerment, but there is such emotional distress that it is deeply going to affect the mental health, the emotional and spiritual health of the mother, that in those cases, it is also permissible for a woman to choose to terminate her pregnancy. But the second thing is that these decisions are morally unclear. The rabbis did not have consensus as to when a fetus becomes a human being, a life worthy of protection apart from the mother. And the rabbis did not have consensus about when it was required or permitted for a woman to terminate her pregnancy. And that's why these decisions are left to the mother, because she is supposed to have her own moral agency to make the determination of how she will conduct her life morally. And if she makes a decision that is morally questionable, it is for her to answer to her conscience and to her God, but not to the state. And part of what makes the United States such an extraordinary example of democracy, and why we should all be next week rejoicing yet again at the anniversary of the birth of this great nation, is that there was a sense among the founders of our nation, and along the way as it has developed its own moral clarity, that we are constantly trying to become a more perfect union. We are constantly striving to figure out a little bit more how we are to best actualize our liberty. But also there was a sense that this needed to be a land where people were free to follow the convictions of their own religious ideologies, and that there would not be one religious ideology imposed by the state on all its citizens. And part of what makes this decision, to me, so tragic and difficult is not whether or not you believe that abortion in a particular circumstance is right or it's wrong. It's that it robs women in many states of being able to activate their own moral agency. And so I'm going to stop there, and we're going to see if there are questions that we want to try to answer from what we've shared tonight. So Kira, do we have questions that have appeared in the chat?
No, we don't have questions in the chat.
Okay, good. So if there's anybody that would like to ask a question, if you look on the bottom of your screen under reactions, you can click on the reactions button and you will see this thing that says raise hand. And if you want to ask a question or offer something, you can click on the raise hand, and that way we'll know that you're raising your hand, because we can't necessarily see everybody. Not everybody has their camera on. So if anybody has something that they'd like to share or comment or ask, you're welcome to use that hand raising function. Really? Barbara Harper, thank you.
My sister-in-law is 73 years old now. And when she was 22, just recently married to my brother, they became pregnant. Everybody rejoiced. And But when she was 5 months pregnant, they diagnosed that the pregnancy was putting such stress on her heart that she was going to need a valve replacement. And it was heart-wrenching, but the decision that my brother was faced to make at that time was terminate the pregnancy to save the mother, or go all the way through the pregnancy and possibly lose his wife. And we had some family phone calls about it. This was in the 70s. And they decided to not only just terminate the pregnancy, but to do a hysterectomy. Because it was such a devastating condition that any pregnancy would perhaps kill the mother. And so they came to that conclusion that they would adopt. And they never got around to adopting. My brother is childless, and he feels very sad about that. But at the same time, his wife is still viable. And they decided to not only just terminate. Something happened there with the technology. And so that was my first, and this was before Roe versus Wade. So it was a difficult time for the whole family, but the right decision was made completely. And I've dealt with so many women over the years, and I've seen babies die in utero, and during labor, before labor begins. 1 year in my practice, we had 23 deaths. We had 23. It was over 150 women that year, but 23 of those babies died in utero without understanding, without cause. And I've always said that there was some kind of bargaining that was going on between mothers and babies. And sometimes babies come early to save the mother's life, and sometimes babies demise and leave to save whatever's going on. So there's so much that we can't see or hear or measure that I really appreciate your going through each one of these things that enlightens us as far as what is Jewish wisdom in pregnancy and birth, and thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm very grateful for you sharing. For those of you who don't know, Barbara teaches midwifery and childbirth techniques literally all over the world, and has accompanied thousands of people on their own journey through childbirth. And I appreciate the story that you shared. It's really, really complicated. And of course, when you prohibit abortion with very broad brushstrokes, you miss all of these very complicated individual heart-wrenching stories. And I think that what sometimes gets lost, and I've had this in the conversations I've had with friends of mine who take a more anti-abortion as part of their moral code, is that there is sort of this sense that people terminate pregnancy willy-nilly. And studies that I read in preparation for this evening and over the weekend showed that 89% of abortions take place before 12 weeks. And only 1%, not even really one, I think it's just over 1% of all terminated pregnancies take place after 20 weeks. And when those later abortions need to take place, it is generally in the context of something really catastrophic, whether it's the discovery of, say, encephaly, where there's no brain formation or other catastrophic birth defects, or in the case that you described, a catastrophic risk to the mother's life that warrants and requires the termination of the pregnancy. These are usually incredibly complicated, gut-wrenching decisions. And so it's interesting in the questions that were asked me through other people, they say, do you just sort of say, abortion is okay on demand up until the moment of childbirth? That's not what people are generally advocating or talking about. That's just not when abortions take place. It tends to be usually at the very beginning, at the discovery of an unwanted or unsafe pregnancy. There was a question in the chat that Susan Stallone asked, which is, do you think there's a lawsuit based on religious liberties that's viable? I am certainly not a lawyer, so I can't really answer that. But for Nancy Joe, turn off the live stream and just listen to the Zoom, and you'll get rid of the double voices. If you turn off the live stream and just listen to the Zoom, you'll be fine. But the question about whether there's a lawsuit, I think that there is. I think certainly it's a really important legal question about the limitations of free exercise with relation to these laws that I think there's an important, and I think also the question, just close, Nancy, just close your browser and just use your Zoom, okay? I'm sorry you're having technical trouble. But the sense, if you look at some of the jurisprudence, especially as the court has moved to the right, in cases, certainly even those that were decided this week, including the case of the football coach who was offering prayers, this court has taken a very strong posture of not limiting one's free exercise. If you look at cases like the Hobby Lobby decision, there were a sense that, your moral values cannot be imposed on by the state. You can't be forced to do something that is in violation of your moral code. And so how that case, there's, as some of you may have seen, Barry Silver filed a lawsuit with Florida regarding the most recent bill on that same basis. I haven't read his lawsuit, and I wouldn't know whether that's the best worded lawsuit. If I had to wager a guess, those with somewhat more constitutional legal skills will find the right kind of test case. But I would think that I would certainly think that there would be a challenge on religious liberty grounds to some of the more restrictive abortion laws that you see in the country. Mom, you have a question? Shirley, you can unmute.
Okay, so I have two actually, but one of them has to do with how united is the Reform Jewish movement in terms of their position on the Supreme Court decision, and are there guidelines or initiatives that are being encouraged in terms of how to address or protest or at least push back? My second question is totally different, and that has to do with the definition of viability. Your older sister was born 6 weeks early, weighing in at a little over 3 pounds. And back in those days, that was very small indeed, and she spent 4 weeks in the hospital. Nowadays, babies are born and are able to be sustained in neonatal care when they're born far, far earlier. So, I don't know where to come down on that exactly in terms of the rabbis, thousands of years ago, obviously didn't have that kind of technology to use as a standard. So I'm not even sure what my question is, but I wondered if there was some kind of Reform Jewish response. But I guess the first one is, is there some guidance from the Reform movement in terms of what happens next? Like
So
laws.
yes, and I'll share that before we're done. The answer is if you go to RAC.org, the Reform Movement's organization, the Religious Action Center, Reform Judaism, has a whole list of things that you can do to advocate. And also the National Council of Jewish Women is also leading a lot of the efforts to deal with this. Viability is a very complicated thing. And what you've seen in the most recent decisions are that they are not looking at viability as the standard, but they're looking at other elements or markers of development. So there are some that are saying the reason why they're picking 15 weeks is because that was sort of when you saw quickening, which was the sort of the earlier standard. Interestingly, that abortion was permitted up until the moment of quickening, sort of before you had the advent of modern science, that you were able to see different things. So it's that same paradox, right? There is a sense, right, that what is growing there is going to be a human being, and it's vital and precious. And at the same time, it's not of the same value yet as that of a human being. And one of the things that Professor Greasley proposes as a good gut check test, even for those who believe that life begins at conception, is, let's say, God forbid, you're in a hospital and the hospital is on fire and you have to get out. And on your way out, you have the opportunity to do one of two things. You can either go to the nursery and save a baby, or you can go to the refrigerator and save 5 embryos.
Wow.
You can't do both. So what do? Obviously, you go get the baby, right? You go get the baby. However, if you really believe that life begins at conception, you would go get the embryos, because that's 5 versus 1. And, better to say 5 lives than 1 life. But there is a sense, right, that that's not really yet a life. Not in the same way that a baby is, which isn't to say that it doesn't have value. It's to say that it doesn't really have the same value. Roberta, I see your hand there.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I have something personal to share and a question. And at the very end, if you want, I have a joke about when life begins. But when Alex and I, when I was first married, got pregnant, first time I'd ever been pregnant, and we were ecstatic. And I had my first ultrasound, and there was no heartbeat. And the doctors termed it a missed abortion, and I had to have a D&C. With the current law, and it didn't occur to me until we were talking tonight, with the current law, that probably means that a woman could not get a D&C to terminate her pregnancy. And she would have to carry that dead embryo until she naturally expelled it or aborted it. And what a horror for anyone going through that.
I don't know how the application of law would be in that very painful circumstance, which is not an uncommon circumstance.
Yeah, no, they told me that, and they told me I would actually be more fertile after the D&C, and then I had my son. But it's just an awful thing for anyone to have to go through, and the courts have now made it much worse.
Yeah.
My question is asking, we were talking about the reform movement, but the other strains of Judaism, the other branches, are we all pretty much on the same page?
It's interesting that you asked that. The answer is kind of and kind of not. So if you read the press release by the Orthodox Union, which is sort of the mainstream Orthodox congregational organization, you know, when you go to buy something kosher, there's that OU, that's the Orthodox Union. And they wrote a press release and they said, we can neither celebrate nor mourn this decision. Because on the one hand, they say the only instance in which an abortion in Jewish law should be permitted is when there is real risk to the mother's life. And if you follow Rabbi Feinstein, that's an incredibly narrow window, which is kind of like the case that Barbara was talking about, where there's a real physical risk to the mother's life. But he discounts mental anguish. However, there are plenty of Orthodox Jews that rightfully follow the Tzitz Eliezer, follow Rabbi Waldenberg, who said, oh, sure, mental anguish counts. And I think that it's complicated, right? The Agudath Israel, the real black hat ultra-Orthodox organization, cheered the ruling because they tend to follow Rabbi Feinstein. But the other thing is that in the way that sort of the world has bounced, you find even within the Jewish community a lot of partisanship. And you find that the much more Orthodox sects in Judaism in American life have affiliated with the Republican Party. And the more progressive elements like the conservative reform, reconstructionist movements, renewal movements have affiliated more with the party that feels more progressive to them, which is the Democratic Party. And so I think that there is, in some respects, a little bit of watching your partisan friends in this, but there is a genuine sense when I've spoken to my friends who are Orthodox that they prefer a more permissive stance so that women have the latitude to follow their religious teachings without interference by the state. Lou.
Thank you. What do our texts and our traditions say about when a body and a soul are joined?
They don't agree. So as we looked at in the sources this evening, there are some that say the moment of conception. There are some that say at the formation of an embryo, which they say is 41 days. And there are some that say at quickening. And there are some that say at birth, when that baby takes the first breath. And so there really isn't a consensus among the sages as to when that happens. And that's, of course, because it's hard to say, right? There is clearly when a baby is 38 weeks, right? And on the cusp of being born, something very different than a baby that is at 8 weeks and is just in the very beginning of its gestation. And the rabbis don't have uniformity about when a soul enters into that being. There is a great midrash that's told that when a child is growing in its mother's womb, that an angel comes and visits that child and lights a candle over its head and teaches it the entire Torah. And so the baby kicks the mother to let her know how much the baby is enjoying Torah study. So those of you who had children, you can remember when your baby kicked you, and that was because they were in the midst of really good Torah study. And so there was sort of a sense among the sages in the Midrash that, right, there was something divine going on in there, even if it wasn't yet a fully extant human life. Kevin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. That was very informative. And a question I'd have is, as you speak about the choice and empowerment, private empowerment, what does it say about a family and spouses working together to affect or make a choice? I think one of the questions I would have is, how do we team up so it's just not the women that are out there fighting to have the freedom of choice, but how do we as partners say that this, and quite frankly, there's so many points right now that are being, school decisions around COVID that were empowered to the families to make and not the state. So how do we turn this into a situation where our family decides what's the right choice, not just an individual with that responsibility?
Well, I think it's really important that we pursue the freedom through allyship, and not to say this is a woman's issue.
Right.
This is a human liberty issue, and it needs to be regarded as such. It's a free exercise issue in America. It is an issue, of course, as I think we are all aware, one that also speaks to a lot of the inequities that we see in society. If you read any of the anecdotal stories that have been pouring out since Friday about women who have been kept from terminating their pregnancies and the impact that that has, especially on women who are of vulnerable or limited means, and that it disproportionately affects women of color and indigenous women and those who don't have access, those who live in rural communities where the nearest place where they can access abortion may be hours and hours and hours away, which would necessitate leaving work or finding hotel rooms and transportation. I read a story about a woman in Corpus Christi who found out she was pregnant 2 days before the Texas ban went into effect. And she found out she was pregnant with twins. She was 12 weeks. And she thought, well, if I wanted to terminate, I'd have to go to New Mexico because there were no appointments. You couldn't do it in Texas. The New Mexico clinic wasn't going to be able to see her for several weeks because they were filled up with appointments. It was going to be a 13-hour drive plus. And she's like, it was just an impossibility. And so instead of continuing with her studies to get her real estate license, she is now home taking care of twins, dependent on the 18-year-old father of her twins and his family, because her mother has been less dependable as a support. That's just one anecdote of many. And I think that's why it's important not to see this as a woman's issue, but to see it as a human issue. But clearly, right, it is an issue that impacts the humanity of women far more severely, if not exclusively, than it does for us as men, which is why it's important for us, I think, to be good allies in this. Candace.
So this is actually interesting, obviously, and maybe I shouldn't have done it on Facebook. I posted an anecdote. It was a little post about how an ectopic pregnancy, a miscarriage, any of these things are now considered abortion. And I put up an anecdotal story. Before I had my son, I had a miscarriage at 10 weeks and I had to have a DNC, very truly a medical procedure. I would have died otherwise, or could have died. I was very sick at the time too. I had found that I was pregnant in the ER getting blood transfusions. I mean, this was not a good time in my life. And it very quickly blew up on my Facebook. And my brother, a friend, wound up posting, everyone was in support except this one individual. And then my brother very quickly, who was an attorney, very quickly started shutting her down, as well as other members of my family who were both all right. And this friend wound up calling me. And this is where my question lies. She's Catholic. Interestingly enough, her son does go to the early learning center at the preschool at Bethel, along with my son. So she's very much ingrained in our Jewish life, but she is Catholic. And she called me and she said, what did I do wrong? I see your family is upset with my viewpoint. What did I do wrong? And I explained to her, as far as I was concerned, that in Judaism, we don't really acknowledge the life until it's living and breathing. And then she said, well, what about viability? I know you spoke about viability here, but I kind of want to go a little more into that. I understand that most of these abortions, if it's beyond 20 weeks, there's something very severely wrong. But what if how does the Jewish law feel? Let's say it's 24 weeks, let's say 26 weeks. 24 weeks is considered viable, but 26, you have a much better chance of survival should that baby be born. And the mother realizes maybe the spouse passed away, maybe there's no money, maybe something's very serious, maybe she has, but it's not a medical emergency, but she chooses to have an abortion due to ridiculous circumstances that might just not allow for her to give this child a good life. Where does Jewish law sit on that one?
So Jewish law, first of all, there are differences in the way that Catholics look at this and the way that Jews look at this.
Right, that I know.
And I think that part of the reason why this needs to be left to the private decision of a mother, and, based on what her physician tells her, based on what counsel she takes from her family, from her religious guidance and her own conscience. And that's where this resides, because for a Catholic person, there may be a different set of moral answers than a Jew or a Muslim or somebody else, right? There's different ways that we look at these questions. Regrettably, we are in a place in our society where we have lost the capacity to have civil discourse around issues of moral complexity. And I lament the fact that somebody can't write a question. So when I put my Facebook post out there, a good friend of mine who's an Orthodox Jew I've known for 30 years, a friend of mine from when I was a junior in college at Hebrew University, said, really? Abortion at any circumstance? I said, no, not in any circumstance. But that's a decision that a mother needs to make. Jewish law would say you should not terminate the pregnancy just because it's not convenient. And even if and you have to take a very strong stance on what constitutes mental anguish versus inconvenience or annoyance, or Jewish law would be very clear that you do not terminate a pregnancy because it's the wrong time. You terminate the pregnancy if you're going to suffer a mental breakdown, where you're literally at risk to your mental health, which is different than saying I'll be very sad. There is also, ideas that, there are other pathways, right? A person might choose to give their child to an adoptive home. There are other things that a mother can do if she can't raise the child herself. And somebody asked in the chat about, what about laws about paternal responsibility? And of course, that those are really important questions. But certainly the idea of terminating a pregnancy just because, this is just not the right time, does not find warrant in Jewish law. However, how is someone able to determine the depth of mental anguish that someone is going to experience by virtue of carrying a child or delivering that child? I think that can only really be determined by the mother and in consultation with family, physician, conscience, religious ideology. And that's why I think so fundamentally it's important that these freedoms be preserved, not because we as Jews, and certainly as Reformed Jews, think anybody should get an abortion at any time willy-nilly, but that's their moral choice to make. And the state shouldn't necessarily restrict someone's moral choices in that way. Amanda.
It's been exhausting, to say the least, with everything going. There's a fight, I feel like every 5 seconds coming around. And there's, it's just starting to relax after the last election, not trying to make anything political right now. But it's between the gun issues right now as a mom, and now sitting with my 14-year-old son discussing this. And then looking at my friends' daughters going into their beautiful years of teenager, early adulthood. It's depressing. And I was just requesting something because I'm really pissed off, excuse my language. I'm really looking for something that you can say or that can do to heal. And is there a prayer that we can talk about to just take that off, because I'm really needing, and several of my friends are needing that prayer, something to help us heal and calm down.
I hear you in that. And, I'd say a couple things, and then we're going to conclude. I couldn't have asked you to tee that up a little better for us. The first thing that I would say is those that have a strong moral conviction that abortion needed to be banned in America spent 50 years working toward that goal assiduously. They spoke out loud and often about their beliefs. They organized all kinds of different initiatives to put their beliefs out there and to try to work one-on-one in different ways to convince America that they were right. They advocated, they lobbied, they worked to ensure that people who represented their ideas and values were elected not simply to national legislatures, but to state and local legislatures, that they had executives elected that shared their beliefs and their values, that would nominate and appoint people to courts that would also share their beliefs and their values. That is how America works, and it is glorious. And so for those who believe that we need to advocate more completely and deliberately for the rights of women to make these choices for themselves, we need to advocate and do that work with ever more ferocity and with strength than was done that created the decision that we just experienced. And we have to be willing to go and advocate and say what we think, and not with vitriol, and not with mean-spiritedness, and not with smugness, but with a sense of love and compassion and humility, while asserting the truths that we know, and then working to try to change the minds of Americans, and working to ensure that those who are elected to office are held to account for this idea and this question. And the fact is, those who share a progressive view have not done that as well as those who share a more regressive view. And I think that we need to be aware of a few things. One is we have agency, and we can fight, and we can advocate, and we can organize, and we can use our power and our voice, the spoken word, the written word, to try to create a better understanding that we need to, in order to try to win more people over to our side, so that different justices are appointed, different laws are passed that ensure a woman's right to the free expression of her conscience as it relates to these very, very difficult and challenging moral questions. And so the thing that I would encourage you to tell yourself and to tell your children is that there have been many fights in American history where it looked like there would never be a promised land. But if we look at what happened in last week's Torah portion, where the Israelites were told, oh, we're sorry to tell you this, it's going to be 40 years longer than you thought, they kept walking. They didn't go back to Egypt. They didn't just lament and say, we're not moving. They said, if we're going to have to wander for 40 more years in the wilderness, we're going to keep putting one foot in front of the other because there's a promised land out there. And if we keep walking, we will reach it. And so how we do that, I think, is where debate and honest dialogue needs to take place. But I think we need to do this in a way that is curious and non-judgmental, that is passionate and compassionate, and in a way that values the humanity of those who may think differently than we do, and to try to help them understand the truth that we know in our own truths, and compare that to the truths that they might see right. So I want to share just a few last pieces. The first is I'd like to offer this prayer, especially for those who may be in this period denied abortion care that they seek. This is written by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg and colleagues at the National Council of Jewish Women. And if you are at home, you can say this with me. May you be safe. May a canopy of safety and peace, health, and care cover you despite everything you are now forced to endure. May you find ways to own your body, your agency, and your dignity, even though your liberty has been taken from you. May you be surrounded by a community of caring hands and loving hearts who can hold you. May you always know that you are holy, sacred, and your will, your autonomy matters and should be respected as such. May you be protected in all ways, able to weather the material, physical, emotional, and spiritual hardships that come your way. May you find within yourself resilience, strength, and bravery, and may you know that you are not alone. For those who want more information, there is going to be through the Women of Reform Judaism, not this coming Saturday night, but next Saturday night, a Havdalah and conversation with people from the Reform movement from all over the country. That'll be next Saturday night, July 9th for Havdalah. That will be at 7:30 p.m. You can see the link here, and we'll put this out on the Temple's website as well. And also for those who want look at additional information, you can look at the website of the National Council for Jewish Women and follow the links there, and also the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, a privilege for me to be here with you this evening. Together, I pray that we can embrace each other and hold each other in these difficult times, and together we may go from strength to strength.